My husband took everything in our divorce. I'm leaving with the house, the cars, and every penny in our accounts, he texted. You should have signed that prenup when you had the chance. Good luck starting over at 42. What Cody didn't know, what his expensive lawyers never discovered, was the secret offshore account I'd built to billions. And by the time he realized what I'd done, it was already too late. I stared at the final divorce decree, the elegant script declaring the end of 15 years together, the document that Cody believed had left me with nothing but my clothes and personal effects. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. His signature was bold, triumphant, a flourish of a man who thought he'd won. I took a sip from my crystal glass, the rare Macallan whiskey warming my throat as I gazed over the Manhattan skyline from my penthouse window. The one he didn't know existed. The one purchased through my holding company 3 years earlier when I first discovered his pattern of deception. The text from my lawyer came exactly at 4:30 p.m. It's done. The divorce is finalized. He's taken the bait entirely. I smiled, setting my phone down on the Italian marble countertop. Cody always underestimated me. From the moment we met at that investment conference in Tokyo, he saw only what he wanted to see: the supportive wife, the charming hostess for his business dinners, the woman who seemed content to stand in his shadow. He never bothered to remember that before we met, I had already made my first 100 million in emerging technologies, that I spoke 5 languages and had built and sold 2 companies before I turned 30, that I had worked silently alongside the venture capital firm that gave him his first big break. To him, I was arm candy who got lucky, an ornament who should be grateful. His text from this morning still lingered on my phone. The movers will be at the house tomorrow to collect anything of value. Don't bother arguing about the art collection. The appraisals all happened without your knowledge, and the prenup you refused would have helped you here. Too bad. The prenup he mentioned, the one I stubbornly refused to sign 15 years ago, was actually his first miscalculation. What he didn't know was that my refusal wasn't born from naivety or romantic delusion. It was strategic. Without a prenup, the exposure was mutual. It gave me room to maneuver, to watch, to plan. And plan I did. I walked across the living room, my bare feet silent against the heated floors, and opened the hidden panel behind what appeared to be a simple bookshelf. Inside, a secure monitor illuminated with a soft blue glow. I pressed my palm against the scanner and entered the 16-digit code. The screen came to life, displaying the current balance, $4.7 billion. Not bad for a woman who, according to the divorce papers, was leaving the marriage with no significant assets or means of support. The bitter truth that Cody never grasped was that our marriage had been over for me 3 years earlier. The night I found the hidden correspondence, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, the evidence that he had been systematically hiding assets and preparing for an exit, presumably with his young assistant Katrina. I could have confronted him then, could have raged and screamed and filed for divorce immediately. But emotion makes for poor strategy, and I wasn't about to let 15 years end with me receiving whatever scraps his lawyers deemed appropriate. Instead, I began my own parallel plan, one that would ensure when the inevitable happened, I would not be the victim of his narrative. The first thing I did was reconnect with my old mentor, Agnes. At 78, she was still one of the sharpest financial minds in the industry and had never quite approved of Cody. He's got hungry eyes, she'd told me at our wedding. Not ambitious hungry, desperate hungry, the kind that's never satisfied. She was right, of course. Agnes introduced me to Orson, a financial architect who specialized in what he called privacy structures. Within 6 months, I had established a complex network of shell companies, trusts, and investment vehicles that would make my movements untraceable, even to someone with Cody's resources. Next came the careful extraction of capital. Nothing. Sudden, nothing that would trigger alerts or raise suspicions. A consulting fee here, an investment opportunity there. Funds moved through a series of transitions, scrubbed clean of connections to me, before arriving at their final destinations. I cultivated a portfolio focused on emerging technologies, quantum computing, advanced biometrics, sustainable energy, storage. High-risk, high-reward investments that Cody had always dismissed as speculative nonsense. When one of my early blockchain investments returned 8,000% in 18 months, I almost wished I could see his face if he knew. But patience was my greatest asset. For 3 years, I maintained the facade. The dutiful wife, the elegant hostess, the woman who seemed blissfully unaware of her husband's mounting betrayals. I watched as he grew bolder, less careful about hiding his contempt, the late nights at the office that reeked of another woman's perfume, the sudden business trips that coincided with Katrina's convenient absences, the thinly veiled insults disguised as jokes at dinner parties. All the while, my separate empire grew. When one of my medical technology investments was acquired by a European conglomerate, my hidden net worth tripled overnight. When I quietly backed a series of AI startups that revolutionized financial forecasting, it doubled again. The ultimate irony was that several of Cody's own investments had unknowingly poured money into companies I controlled through my labyrinth of entities. He had, in essence, been funding his own demise. And now, here we were. The divorce finalized. His victory, as he saw it, complete. He believed he had orchestrated the perfect exit, draining our visible accounts, claiming our shared properties, even taking the vintage car collection I had helped curate. The prenuptial agreement I had foolishly refused to sign left me exposed, or so he thought. What he failed to understand was that I hadn't been building a defense. I had been setting a trap. The phone on the counter buzzed again. Another text, this time from Kyle, my private investigator. He's celebrating at Maison Azur. Table for 2. The girl's there. I smiled. Of course he was. Cody was nothing if not predictable in his cliches. Expensive champagne, a Michelin-starred restaurant, the much younger woman hanging on his every word. No doubt regaling her with tales of his masterful strategy, his complete victory. I wondered idly how long it would take him to realize something was wrong. A day? Perhaps a week? The carefully laid breadcrumbs would eventually lead him to questions, and those questions would yield disturbing answers. By the time he understood the full scope of what had happened, the final phase of my plan would already be in motion. I refilled my glass and moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city lights begin to flicker on as dusk settled over Manhattan. The penthouse was silent except for the faint hum of the climate control system. I had always preferred this kind of silence, not empty, but expectant. Like the pause before an orchestra begins to play. 3 years ago, this moment would have devastated me. I would have been shattered by his betrayal, broken by the casual cruelty with which he discarded our marriage. I might have begged, pleaded, tried to make him see reason. But that woman, the one who believed in the illusion of our partnership, no longer existed. In her place stood someone else entirely. Someone who had learned that vulnerability without vigilance was just naivety dressed in prettier clothes. My phone chimed with an incoming email. The subject line read, "Transfer complete, Zurich." Another piece moving into position. I didn't need to open it. I already knew what it contained. Confirmation that the final $380 million had been moved from my tertiary holding company into position for what came next. The timing was crucial. Every financial move I'd made over the past 3 years had been calculated not just for growth, but for this precise moment, when Cody believed he had won completely, when his guard would be at its lowest. I moved to my home office, the room secured with biometric locks that responded only to my presence. Inside, 3 monitors displayed different aspects of my operation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first showed market positions across 7 exchanges. The second tracked the movement of key assets through my network of entities. The third displayed a real-time update of Cody's digital footprint, his credit card transactions, phone location, email activity. Not strictly legal, perhaps, but then, neither was what he had done. I sat down at the desk, my fingers tracing the cool surface of the rare Madagascar ebony. The wood was nearly extinct now, impossible to source legally. Cody had commissioned this desk 5 years ago through questionable channels, a gift for my birthday, though really it was just another trophy for him to display. When I left our shared home, it was the only piece of furniture I arranged to have disappeared during the moving process. A small reminder that I could take things too when I wanted them. I opened the secure messaging platform that connected me to my team. 5 people, scattered across the globe, each experts in their fields, each compensated generously enough to ensure absolute loyalty. None knew the complete picture, a necessary compartmentalization that protected both them and me. Status updates, I typed. The responses came quickly. Esther, legal. Final divorce decree registered. All documentation in order. The shell company collapse is primed for activation upon your command. Marcus, cybersecurity. Monitoring systems active. Target security remains unchanged. Access. Pathways maintained. Digital breadcrumbs placed as instructed. Agnes, financial. Asset positioning complete. Trigger mechanism prepped. Regulatory blind spots confirmed. Kyle, surveillance. Subject remains at Maison Azure. Estimated departure. 10:30 p.m. Secondary subject appears intoxicated. Audio capture operational. Orson, strategic. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 preparations finalized. Timeline remains optimal. I closed the platform and leaned back in my chair. Everyone was in position. Everything was ready. People often misunderstand. Revenge. They think it's about passion, about rage unleashed. But true revenge, the kind that doesn't just hurt but fundamentally changes the equation, that requires patience. Cold, calculating patience. Cody thought he had taken everything. The houses in the Hamptons, Aspen, and Palm Beach. The art collection worth 8 figures. The vineyard in Napa, the private jet, the yacht docked in Monaco. He had been so focused on the visible assets, the tangible symbols of wealth, that he never looked deeper. Never questioned why I hadn't fought harder, why my lawyer, one of the most aggressive divorce attorneys in New York, had seemed almost passive during negotiations. I smiled at the memory of his confused expression during our final mediation session. The slightly furrowed brow when my representative conceded yet another point without much resistance. He'd misread my calm as defeat, my strategic retreats as surrender. That was Cody's greatest weakness. He understood price, but not value. He could calculate net worth but couldn't recognize true worth, and he was about to learn the difference in the most painful way possible. I reached for my secure phone, not the one he knew about, and dialed. A number from memory. It's time, I said when the line connected. Initiate the first disclosure. Understood, came the reply. Timeline for full implementation? I paused, considering the chessboard one final time. 72 hours, I decided. Let's give him one last weekend of blissful ignorance. As I ended the call, a strange sense of calm washed over me. This wasn't about anger anymore. It had evolved into something else entirely, a clinical correction of a fundamental imbalance, a reckoning long overdue. Outside my window, a private helicopter cut across the darkening sky, its lights blinking steadily against the twilight. In a few short days, Cody's world would begin to unravel, not suddenly, but methodically. Thread by thread, assumption by assumption, certainty by certainty. I would dismantle everything he believed about his victory, his future, and most importantly, about me. 15 years ago, I met Cody at a technology investment summit in Tokyo. I was there representing my second successful startup, a cybersecurity firm that had pioneered a new encryption protocol. He was there as the rising star of Meridian Ventures, a firm that had recently made headlines with 3 consecutive unicorn investments. I remember the moment clearly, standing by the koi pond in the hotel's interior garden, discussing quantum computing applications with the CTO of a Japanese conglomerate. Cody appeared at my elbow, champagne flute in hand, his confidence practically radiating from him in waves. I couldn't help overhearing, he said, extending his hand. Cody Blackwell, your perspective on quantum resistance is fascinating. He was handsome in that deliberate way of men who invest significantly in their appearance. Tailored suit, perfect haircut, subtle cologne. His smile revealed teeth that had clearly been cosmetically enhanced, too white and too even to be natural. Should have seen it then, the careful construction of an image designed to impress, to disarm. But I was 27, already worth 8 figures, and feeling invincible after my latest round of funding. Haley Parker, I replied, accepting his handshake. And quantum resistance isn't fascinating, it's essential. The security infrastructure most companies rely on will be obsolete within a decade. He laughed. Genuinely, it seemed. I've just met you, and you've already saved me millions in potential bad investments. That night turned into dinner at a 3 Michelin-star restaurant overlooking Tokyo Bay. Dinner turned into a weekend exploring the city together. The weekend expanded into flying me to his next meeting in Singapore, then to his home in New York. Everything moved quickly, too quickly, I realized later. By the 6-month mark, we were engaged. By 1 year, married in an elaborate ceremony at the Plaza Hotel, covered by society pages and financial publications alike. Tech Wunderkind weds Venture. Capital Star. The first 3 years were not good exactly, but convincing. Cody was ambitious, driven, frequently absent, but always attentive when present. We traveled extensively, acquired property, built what appeared to be an enviable life. I sold my company for 9 figures 2 years into our marriage. The plan had been to take a year off, then start something new. But Cody had other ideas. You don't need to work, he said one evening in our Hamptons house, his tone casual but brooking no argument. Your expertise is better used advising my investments. Besides, I need someone I trust to manage our social obligations. I should have pushed back harder, should have maintained my independence. But I was in love, or thought I was. And the idea of building something together had its appeal. So I compromised, taking board positions rather than operational roles, becoming the elegant wife who hosted the right people and said the right things. The warning signs accumulated gradually, like sediment in still water. First came the financial control. Our accounts merged, with Cody insisting he had people who would manage everything. My substantial personal wealth was absorbed into what he called our portfolio, though the statements always came addressed to him alone. Then the subtle undermining. At dinner parties, he would interrupt my explanations of technical concepts with, what my wife means is, or, let me simplify what Haley is trying to say. Small cuts, but they accumulated. The isolation happened next. My close friends were suddenly too negative or not aligned with our goals. My mentor Agnes was stuck in outdated thinking. My industry contacts became unnecessary distractions. I allowed it to happen. That's the truth I've had to face. I participated in my own diminishment. Each concession seemed small at the time, each boundary easily redrawn, until one day I looked up and didn't recognize the carefully curated life I was living. The turning point came during a weekend when Cody was supposedly at a conference in London. a quarterly statement from a bank I didn't recognize arrived at our home, a rare administrative error in his otherwise meticulous concealment. I opened it, expecting nothing significant. Instead, I found details of an account in the Cayman Islands with 8 figures, entirely in his name. An account I knew nothing about. That discovery led me to dig deeper. I hired a forensic accountant under the guise of a potential investment, giving her access to what financial records I could gather. What she found shocked even my suspicious mind. Cody had been systematically siphoning money away, not just his earnings, but portions of my assets as well, into a complex network of offshore accounts. He had been preparing for an exit, it seemed, almost from the beginning. Worse, he had leveraged my technical expertise and connections to advance his career, taking credit for introductions I had made, insights I had shared. My silent contribution had helped build his reputation as a visionary investor. The final confirmation came from Kyle, the private investigator I hired after finding the statement. He provided photographs of Cody with Katrina, his assistant, entering hotel rooms, intimate dinners, weekend trips when he was supposedly working. I sat in our library, surrounded by first editions I had helped collect, staring at the evidence of my husband's duplicity spread across an antique desk. The pain was acute but clarifying. Like a fever breaking, it brought terrible clarity. I had 3 choices: confront him and enter a messy public divorce where his greater resources and connections would likely prevail, ignore it all and continue living the lie, or begin my own careful exit strategy. I chose the third option. That night, as Cody slept beside me, having returned from London with a gift of earrings I would later discover were actually purchased at Heathrow in a hasty afterthought, I made my decision. If he could build a secret life brick by brick, so could I. The next morning, I called Agnes. I need your help, I told her, and absolute discretion. I expected questions, perhaps even judgment for having allowed myself to be maneuvered into such a position. Instead, she simply said, "I've been waiting for this call for 7 years. Come to my office tomorrow. Use the private entrance." Agnes's corner office in the historic Woolworth building felt like stepping into another era. Dark wood, green glass lamps, windows overlooking the East River. She listened without interruption as I laid out what I had discovered. When I finished, she removed her reading glasses and leaned forward. "Haley, do you remember what I told you at your engagement party?" I nodded. "You said I was making a mistake." "No," she corrected. "I said you were playing a different game than he was. He was playing for control. You were playing for partnership." She sighed. "The question now is, what game are you going to play next?" "I want what's rightfully mine," I said, "and I want him to understand exactly who he underestimated." Agnes smiled then, a sharp, predatory expression I had never seen on her before. "Then let's make sure he learns that lesson thoroughly." She pressed an intercom button on her desk. "Orson, please join us, and bring the Singapore files." That meeting marked the beginning of my counter-strategy. The beginning of the path that led to this moment, standing in my secret penthouse, watching the city darken as Cody celebrated what he thought was his triumph. He had taken my visible assets. Yes, the houses, the art, the cars, the symbols of success he had always valued most. But in focusing on those trophies, he had missed the far greater wealth I had built right under his nose. Assets that would soon become the instruments of his education. The morning after my meeting with Agnes and Orson, I returned home with a yaw. Clarity I hadn't felt in years. Cody was already gone. An early meeting with investors from Dubai, he'd said, though I now suspected Katrina was the real agenda. I moved through our Central Park West apartment with new eyes, seeing it not as home, but as a stage set where I'd been performing a role for too long. Each carefully curated piece, the Rothko on the living room wall, the Giacometti sculpture in the foyer, the rare first editions in the library, represented not just wealth, but Cody's need to display it. I went to my closet and removed a small lockbox hidden beneath my winter sweaters, one of the few private spaces I still maintained. Inside was a thumb drive containing backups of my personal records from before the marriage. Old account numbers, contacts, passwords, digital breadcrumbs to my former independence. This would become my first real move in the long game ahead. Not dramatic, not immediately effective, but necessary. Like a chess player positioning a seemingly insignificant pawn that would later prove crucial, Orson had been explicit in his advice. The first rule of financial extrication is to establish clean channels. No connections to existing accounts, no digital trails, nothing that could be monitored or traced. I needed seed capital, money I could access without raising flags in Cody's elaborate monitoring systems. He tracked our joint accounts meticulously, his financial team producing monthly reports on every transaction. Any unusual movement would trigger immediate questions. The solution came from an unexpected source. 6 years earlier, I had made a personal angel investment in a friend's medical device startup, $75,000 that Cody had dismissed as charity for your college friend. The company had since been acquired, and I was owed a payout of nearly $2 million. The acquisition paperwork had arrived while Cody was in Hong Kong, and I had never mentioned it to him, my small act of financial rebellion. The check was scheduled to arrive the following week, made out to me personally. It wasn't much in the context of our overall wealth, but it was mine alone, and more importantly, it was clean. Untraceable to our joint holdings and unknown to Cody's financial team. With this initial capital, I could begin building the infrastructure I would need. I took out my personal phone, not the one Cody knew about, but an older model I kept charged. In my yoga studio, ostensibly as a dedicated meditation timer, I dialed a number I still remembered by heart. Meridian Trust, how may I direct your call? Came the crisp response. Thomas Wakefield, please, I said. Tell him it's Haley Parker. I deliberately used my maiden name. Thomas had been my personal banker before my marriage. He had advised against combining all my assets with Cody's, a recommendation I had foolishly ignored. When Cody insisted we move all our banking to his preferred institutions, I had reluctantly closed my accounts with Thomas. Haley, he answered. Moments later, surprise evident in his voice. It's been what, 7 years? 8, I corrected. Too long. I'm wondering if you have time for lunch this week? There's a matter I'd like to discuss privately. His hesitation was brief but noticeable. Of course. Would tomorrow work? There's a new place on Madison that's excellent. Very private. I understood the subtext. Perfect. 1 o'clock? I'll make the reservation under my name. I ended the call feeling the first flutter of something I hadn't experienced in years. The exhilaration of taking action, of reclaiming agency. It was a small step, almost insignificant in the larger scheme, but it was mine. The next day, I met Thomas at an unmarked restaurant accessed through a high-end furniture showroom. He had aged well, silver at the temples now, but the same sharp eyes and discreet manner I remembered. After brief pleasantries, I laid out what I needed. A new account, completely separate from my married finances, with sophisticated privacy protections. No statements, no correspondence, digital access through secure channels only. May I ask, he began. I cut him off gently. You may not. The less you know, the better for both of us. He nodded, understanding immediately. I can arrange everything. The initial deposit? Approximately $2 million, arriving next week. If he was surprised by the amount, he didn't show it. Thomas had always been the model of professional discretion. And your long-term financial objectives for these funds? I considered the question carefully. Growth is secondary. This is about creating separation and security. A financial firewall, if you will. He made a note in a small leather-bound book. I understand completely. I'll need a signature on several documents. He slid a folder across the table. These can be processed immediately. The account will be active by close of business. Today. I signed where indicated, using a slightly modified version of my signature. Different enough from the one Cody would recognize, but still legally valid. There's one more thing, I said as I handed back the folder. I'll need introductions to certain specialists, people who operate with absolute confidentiality. What areas of expertise? Corporate structure, international banking, asset protection. I paused. And someone who specializes in digital privacy. Thomas closed his notebook. I'll make the arrangements. The contacts will come through secure channels only. No names will be mentioned over any traceable communication. As we parted, he held my hand a moment longer than necessary, his expression serious. Haley, whatever you're planning, be careful. I'm being precisely as careful as needed, I replied. That afternoon, while Cody was supposedly in meetings, though his location tracking, which I had secretly enabled on his phone, showed him at a hotel downtown, I made two more crucial moves. First, I visited a safe deposit box I had maintained at a different bank, one Cody knew nothing about, where I stored certain personal documents. My original birth certificate, passport copies, family heirlooms too precious to leave in the apartment. I added the documentation from Thomas and a sealed envelope containing access codes to my new financial infrastructure. Second, I purchased a new laptop with cash at a busy electronics store in Midtown, making sure to dress down in clothes Cody had never seen and wearing sunglasses despite the overcast day. I paid for 3 years of advanced VPN service and a suite of privacy software recommended by Marcus, the cybersecurity expert Orson had introduced me to. That evening, I powered up the new computer in a coffee shop far from our usual haunts. Using the secured connection, I created the first of what would become many shell companies. This one registered in Delaware under a name generated by an algorithm designed to appear utterly forgettable. Haley Holdings LLC was born, its ownership structure deliberately obscured through a series of nominee directors and virtual office addresses. Its stated purpose was investment management, vague enough to justify virtually any financial activity. Within this innocuous-seeming entity, I built the first layer of what would eventually become my financial fortress. As I worked, a part of me wondered if I was overreacting, creating elaborate contingencies for a worst-case scenario that might never materialize. But another voice, clearer, colder, reminded me of the offshore accounts I had discovered, of Cody's methodical financial secrecy. He had been planning his exit strategy for years. Now, I was planning mine. The difference was that mine would succeed. When I returned home that evening, I was different. The change wasn't visible. I wore the same carefully composed expression, asked the same polite questions about his day, performed the same role of supportive wife. But beneath that performance, something fundamental had shifted. I had taken the first step from reaction to action, from victim to strategist. That night, as Cody slept beside me, I lay awake planning the next moves in what I already understood would be a years-long campaign. The timeline would need to be precise. Moving too quickly would alert him, too slowly would risk discovery. I would need to be patient, methodical, always several steps ahead. I had no illusions about the complexity of what I was undertaking. Extracting myself financially from our entangled lives would require extraordinary care. Building a separate fortune would demand both brilliance and discretion. But as I finally drifted toward sleep, I felt something that had been absent for too long. Purpose. And beneath that, something even more powerful. The absolute certainty that I would not only survive what was coming, but emerge victorious. The $2 million from my medical device investment arrived exactly as expected. A simple check made out to my maiden name, delivered in an unmarked business envelope. I deposited it personally into my new account at Meridian Trust, watching as Thomas processed the transaction with his characteristic efficiency. "The funds will clear by tomorrow," he said, sliding a small encrypted drive across his desk. "This contains access credentials for your secure portal. The password protocol requires changes every 48 hours. But $2 million, while a start, was merely the spark. What I needed was a financial accelerant, something that could rapidly multiply my resources without triggering attention. Opportunity arrived 3 weeks later during our annual New Year's gala at our Aspen estate. The gathering was a calculated display of wealth and influence. 60 guests, all power players in finance and technology, brought together ostensibly for celebration, but actually for deal-making. Midway through the evening, I overheard a conversation between two venture capitalists discussing a quantum computing startup called Nexus Quantum. The founder, a former DARPA scientist, had developed a breakthrough in qubit stability that would potentially solve the decoherence problem plaguing quantum systems. "The Series A is nearly closed," one VC mentioned, swirling his bourbon. "We're leading with 15 million, but there's room for another 5 from the right partner." This was exactly the kind of opportunity I needed. Early access to potentially transformative technology, outside Cody's usual investment sectors. I joined their conversation casually, asking informed questions about the technical approach. My background gave me credibility they weren't expecting from Cody's wife. By midnight, I had secured an introduction to the founder and an invitation to review their technical documentation. The next morning, while Cody nursed a hangover, I slipped away to my private study and examined the materials using my secure laptop. The technology was genuinely revolutionary, a new approach to quantum error correction that could increase coherence times by orders of magnitude. I moved quickly. Using the encrypted communication channel Thomas had established, I instructed him to transfer $1.8 million to a newly created investment vehicle, Parallax Ventures LLC, another entity in my growing network of shells. From there, I reached out directly to the Nexus Quantum founder, Dr. Elena Mirza. "I represent a private investment group interested in your Series A," I wrote, using an email identity completely separate from my personal or family accounts. "We're prepared to commit $5 million, but require certain conditions. My key stipulation: a portion of my investment would convert to preferred shares with specific liquidation preferences. More importantly, I negotiated a clause allowing early distribution of proceeds to minority investors under certain triggering events, an unusual provision that raised eyebrows, but was ultimately accepted due to the competitive funding environment. This single investment became the cornerstone of my financial separation strategy. Within 14 months, Nexus Quantum's breakthrough attracted acquisition interest from major tech companies. When the bidding war ended, my $5 million investment, leveraged through a structure Orson had designed, returned nearly $47 million. The beauty of this counter-move lay in its complete invisibility to Cody. While he focused on traditional investment classes, real estate, established tech companies, commodities, I concentrated on emerging technologies with exponential growth potential. More importantly, I ensured these investments remained outside the financial ecosystem he monitored. Different banks, different investment vehicles, different legal jurisdictions, a parallel financial universe he couldn't see and wouldn't think to look for. The Nexus Quantum windfall provided the capital base I needed for rapid expansion. Working. With Agnes, I developed an investment thesis focusing on 3 specific technology sectors: advanced cryptography, synthetic biology, and next-generation energy storage. These fields share key characteristics, Agnes noted during one of our secure meetings. They're technically complex, making them difficult for non-specialists to evaluate properly. They're early stage, with massively asymmetric risk-reward profiles. And most importantly, they're outside Cody's expertise and interest. With each successful investment, I channeled profits through increasingly sophisticated structures. Cayman. Entities fed Luxembourg holding companies, which invested through Singapore funds, which ultimately connected back to my core assets through a labyrinth of legal arrangements so complex that even the lawyers who helped create them couldn't map the entire system. Orson called it financial steganography, hiding assets not through concealment, but through complexity. Even if someone suspects something exists, he explained, they won't be able to find it without already knowing exactly where to look. 18 months after my initial moves, my separate fortune had grown to just over $200 million. Still modest compared to our family's visible wealth, but entirely mine and completely invisible to Cody. During this period, I maintained my role as the perfect wife impeccably. I attended the right events, charmed the right people, maintained our homes with exacting standards. I gave Cody no reason to suspect anything had changed. When he mentioned investments or financial matters, I displayed the carefully calibrated interest he expected, informed enough to appear engaged, but never threatening his perception of superior expertise. The Tokyo real estate play netted us 14%, he mentioned one evening over dinner, clearly expecting admiration. That's wonderful, I replied with precisely the right amount of supportive enthusiasm, never revealing that one of my synthetic biology investments had returned over 3,000% in the same period. My first countermove was complete. I had established independent financial resources substantial enough to support the next phases of my strategy. More importantly, I had proven to myself that I could operate undetected, building power and leverage while maintaining a perfect facade. What Cody saw as submission was actually calculation. What he interpreted as acceptance was strategic patience, and what he would eventually recognize as defeat was already in motion, one careful move at a time. With my financial infrastructure established and growing, I turned my attention to securing other vital assets, physical, legal, and informational protections that would become essential when Cody eventually made his move. The first was real estate. While Cody focused on trophy properties, mansions in recognizable zip codes, penthouses in famous buildings, vacation homes in prestigious resorts, I quietly acquired properties through my network of entities, prioritizing security and anonymity over status. The Manhattan penthouse where I now stood was purchased through Horizon Acquisition Trust, a vehicle 6 layers removed from any connection to me. The building itself was unremarkable from the outside, a renovated pre-war structure in Tribeca with excellent security but deliberately low profile. Similar properties followed, a modernist house on a remote stretch of Oregon coastline, a converted lighthouse on a private island in Maine, a mountain retreat accessible only by helicopter in northern New Mexico. Each was purchased with cash, held by different entities, staffed by personnel who had never met me in person, and maintained in constant readiness. Physical security is as important as financial security, Orson had advised. You need places to go that he can't find, can't reach, and ideally doesn't know exist. The second protective measure was documentation. Working with Esther, the razor-sharp attorney Agnes had introduced me to, I created a comprehensive archive of our married life, financial records, email communications, phone logs, travel itineraries, photographs, everything meticulously organized and authenticated. In high net worth divorces, information asymmetry determines outcomes, Esther explained during one of our secure meetings in her Brooklyn office. The partner with better documentation nearly always prevails. She helped me establish legal structures that would protect my interests when the inevitable confrontation came. Multiple trusts with carefully crafted provisions, intellectual property, assignments for technologies I had helped develop but received no credit for, and most importantly, evidence of Cody's systematic concealment of assets. We're not just building a defense, Esther said, reviewing the growing legal architecture. We're creating a position so strong that he'll realize pursuing you is against his own interests. But perhaps the most crucial secondary protection involved technology. Marcus, the cybersecurity expert on my team, implemented what he called digital compartmentalization, a comprehensive system ensuring my activities remained invisible to Cody's surveillance. Your husband has sophisticated monitoring in place, Marcus explained, showing me evidence of spyware on my official devices and throughout our shared homes. He's tracking your calls, emails, movements, and financial activities. The solution was elegant. I would allow these systems to continue monitoring a carefully curated version of my life, while my real activities took place on entirely separate infrastructure. Marcus established a private communication network using hardened devices, rotating encryption keys, and physical security measures that would impress intelligence agencies. Every message, file transfer, and digital meeting occurred within this secure ecosystem, completely isolated from conventional monitoring. Think of it as a digital diversion, he said. We're giving his surveillance exactly what it expects to see, while the real you operates in a parallel dimension he can't access. This technological protection extended to my physical movements as well. When I needed to visit my separate properties or meet with my team, I developed a system of deliberate misdirection. A spa appointment would be booked and attended, but I would leave through a staff exit while a paid body double remained, creating digital evidence of my continued presence. Private flights were registered to shell companies with no connection to me. Travel documents used identities established through legal but obscure means. I even employed physical disguises when necessary, changes subtle enough to avoid attention, but sufficient to defeat facial recognition and casual observation. Different hair, different posture, different style, small alterations that accumulated into effective anonymity. All these protective measures converged into a comprehensive security system, financial, physical, legal, and digital layers working in concert to ensure that when Cody finally moved against me, I would be prepared from every angle. Throughout this preparation phase, I maintained my outward role impeccably. I hosted our seasonal galas, attended charity boards, accompanied Cody to business functions, the perfect corporate wife, seemingly content with her diminished role. If he noticed my occasional absences, they were always explainable. Shopping, trips, spa weekends, visits to a fictitious friend suffering through chemo. I fed his surveillance systems exactly the data they expected, never deviating enough to trigger suspicion. 3 years into my counter-strategy, an unexpected development accelerated my timeline. While using one of my secure access points into our home network, I discovered a series of consultations Cody had initiated with high-profile divorce attorneys known for representing men in contentious high-net-worth separations. He was preparing his exit, just as I had suspected. The discovery should have been alarming, but instead, I felt an almost serene confirmation. The game I had been preparing for was finally approaching its active phase. That evening, as we dressed for yet another corporate dinner, I watched Cody adjust his tie in the mirror, so confident, so utterly unaware that his carefully planned escape strategy was about to collide with my far more thorough preparation. "You look thoughtful tonight," he commented, noticing my reflection behind him. I smiled with practiced warmth. "Just appreciating the view," I replied, allowing him to assume I meant his reflection. What I was actually appreciating was the knowledge that my secondary protective measures were complete. My parallel life, financially independent, physically secure, legally fortified, and digitally invisible, was fully operational. When Cody finally made his move, he would discover that the woman he thought he was leaving with nothing had already built something he couldn't touch, couldn't find, and couldn't begin to comprehend. The divorce proceedings began exactly as I had anticipated. Cody's lawyer, Elliot Hoffman, a notorious shark known for aggressive tactics, filed the petition on a Tuesday morning with specific timing designed to catch me unprepared. The papers were served while I was supposedly alone at our Manhattan apartment, delivered by a process server who took obvious satisfaction in his role. I accepted the documents with a carefully calibrated display of shock and confusion. The server, no doubt instructed to report back on my reaction, would have described a woman caught completely off guard, struggling to maintain composure as her world collapsed. It was, of course, a performance. I had known the filing was coming for 3 days, thanks to Marcus's ongoing surveillance of Cody's communications. I had reviewed a draft of the petition before it was even finalized, courtesy of a source Esther had cultivated within Hoffman's firm. The terms were breathtakingly vindictive. Cody claimed I had contributed negligible value to our marital estate. He sought to retain all major assets, properties, investments, art, vehicles, offering only a modest monthly stipend that would expire after 5 years. The document painted me as an ornamental wife whose comfortable lifestyle had been entirely dependent on his financial genius. According to the carefully constructed timeline I had pieced together, Cody expected me to panic. To call friends who would be unavailable, he had already started a whisper campaign about my increasing instability. To seek emergency legal representation and be forced to accept whoever was available on short notice. Instead, I waited precisely 4 hours before contacting Esther, who officially became my attorney of record by that afternoon. Her initial response to Hoffman was a masterpiece of measured restraint, neither aggressive enough to suggest preparedness, nor weak enough to indicate surrender. Cody's first attempt to regain control came the following day. All credit cards in my name were suddenly declined. Access to our joint accounts was restricted. The household staff at our primary residence were terminated without notice, and security codes changed. These financial pressure tactics were supposed to leave me desperate, willing to accept unfavorable terms to regain access to basic resources. Had I been the unprepared spouse he imagined, they might have worked. Instead, I simply activated the parallel financial infrastructure I had built. My independent credit cards, accounts, and resources functioned perfectly. When the statement from my apparently frozen primary credit card arrived days later, I noted with amusement that my last purchase had been a modest lunch at a cafe near our home, hardly the desperate spending spree of someone anticipating being cut off. Cody's second move came a week later, when he orchestrated what was meant to be a devastating personal betrayal. 3 of my closest friends from our social circle reached out within hours of each other, inviting me to lunch or coffee to talk about what's happening. Marcus had intercepted their earlier communications with Cody. Each had agreed to meet with me and report back on my emotional state, financial concerns, and any revelations about legal strategy. In exchange, they received promises of continued social access to Cody and his influential circle. I accepted all 3 invitations, using each meeting to feed carefully crafted misinformation. To one, I expressed confusion about basic financial matters. To another, I confided fears about affording proper legal representation. To the third, I revealed apparent anxiety about finding somewhere to live. All of this, I knew, would be relayed directly to Cody, reinforcing his belief that I was floundering exactly as he had planned. His third attempt at control was more direct. 10 days after filing, he requested an amicable conversation to discuss terms at a restaurant of his choosing. The location, a private dining room at an exclusive club where he was a member but I was only permitted as his guest, was another calculated power play. I arrived 15 minutes late, a deliberate choice that I knew would irritate his obsessive punctuality. He sat at the head of a small table, a manila folder placed precisely before him, his expression a practiced blend of regret and resolution. "Haley," he began, using the conciliatory tone he reserved for business opponents he intended to crush. "This doesn't need to be adversarial. I think we can reach arrangements that work for both of us." I sat down, arranging my features into an expression of wounded dignity with just a hint of fear. "I'm still trying to understand why, Cody. After 15 years, I deserve that much." He launched into a clearly rehearsed speech about growing, apart, and different priorities, never once mentioning Katrina or the true financial motivations behind his decision. As he spoke, I nodded at appropriate intervals, appearing to hang on every word while actually observing his tells. The slight tightening around his eyes when lying, the unconscious adjustment of his watch when discussing money. Finally, he opened the folder and slid a document across to me. I'm prepared to be generous, despite what my lawyers advise. This offer gives you the Central Park condo and a settlement that will keep you comfortable. I glanced at the document without touching it. The generous offer represented less than 1% of our actual marital assets, though of course, significantly more than the initial filing had proposed. This was the classic anchoring technique. Start with an outrageous position to make a merely unfair one seem reasonable by comparison. I'll need time to review this with my attorney, I said softly. His expression hardened slightly. Haley, involving aggressive lawyers will only deplete the estate. Everyone loses except the attorneys. This is a fair offer considering your contributions to our marriage? The condescension in his voice was palpable. This was the real Cody, the one he had increasingly allowed me to see in private as his plans progressed. I reached for the document, my fingers trembling slightly. Another calculated display of weakness. I just need some time to process everything. He nodded, satisfied. In his mind, I was behaving exactly as expected, overwhelmed, uncertain, and fundamentally outmatched. As I left the restaurant, I texted Kyle a single word. Proceeding. Phase 2 of my counter strategy was now active. Cody's initial attempts to control the divorce narrative had failed, though he didn't yet realize it. Each move he made thinking he was cornering me only positioned him more precisely within my own design. His confidence, his certainty of victory, was exactly what I needed him to maintain, for just a little while longer. 3 weeks into the divorce proceedings, I made my first offensive move. Until this point, I had been entirely reactive in Cody's eyes, responding to his filings, his financial restrictions, his settlement offers. This carefully maintained appearance of defensive posturing had lulled him into dangerous overconfidence. The confrontation began with a seemingly innocuous legal filing by Esther, a standard request for financial disclosure, something expected in any divorce. The document itself appeared routine, listing categories of assets that should be declared: real estate, investment accounts, business interests, artwork, vehicles. What made this filing different was a seemingly minor addendum on page 17. A specific request for information regarding any and all financial interests in the Cayman Islands, particularly those associated with Blackwell Horizon Partners or related entities. Blackwell Horizon Partners was Cody's secret offshore structure, the one I had discovered 3 years earlier, the catalyst for my own counter-strategy. Its existence was known only to Cody, his private banker, and the attorney who had established it, or so he believed. I wasn't in the room when Cody received notification of the filing, but Kyle's surveillance captured his reaction: the sudden stillness, the rereading of the specific paragraph, the immediate call to his attorney with explicit instructions to step outside his office to take the call. Even through the surveillance footage without audio, the tension in his body language was unmistakable. Within 40 minutes, I received the call I had been anticipating. My phone displayed Cody's name, the first direct contact he had initiated since serving the divorce papers. I let it ring 4 times before answering, my voice carefully calibrated to sound distracted. Hello? We need to talk. His tone was controlled but tight. Not over the phone, in person. I paused, as if considering this request. I'm not sure that's a good idea, Cody. Esther advised that all communication should this afternoon. The house. 4 o'clock. He cut me off sharply. Come alone. If you bring your lawyer, this conversation becomes very different. The threat was implicit, but clear. 4 o'clock. He hung up. I smiled at the blank phone screen. His urgency confirmed what I already knew. The mention of Blackwell Horizon had struck precisely the nerve I'd intended. Now came the delicate part of the confrontation, the careful balance between revealing enough knowledge to unsettle him while concealing the true extent of my preparation. At exactly 4:15 p.m., late enough to signal independence but not so late as to provoke real anger, I arrived at what had been our primary Manhattan residence. The doorman, clearly briefed on the situation, escorted me up with uncomfortable deference, no longer certain of my status in the building Cody now controlled. Cody waited in the living room, standing by the windows overlooking Central Park. He didn't turn when I entered. A small power play intended to make me approach him, to place me in the position of supplicant. Instead, I took a seat on the sofa and waited in silence. After nearly a minute, he finally turned. "How did you know about Blackwell Horizon?" No greeting. No preamble, the question that had clearly been consuming him since the filing. I maintained an expression of mild confusion. "I'm not sure what you mean. Esther prepared the disclosure requests. Standard procedure, from what I understand." His eyes narrowed, searching my face for deception. That specific entity, that specific jurisdiction, that's not standard procedure. I shrugged slightly. I believe her team reviews financial patterns, looking for common structures used in high-net-worth divorces. Maybe something in our regular accounts suggested offshore holdings? I offered this plausible explanation with just enough uncertainty to sound genuine. He moved to the bar, pouring himself 3 fingers of the rare Japanese whiskey he reserved for significant moments. His hand was steady, but the amount he poured betrayed his agitation. "Let's be direct," he said, turning back to me. "What exactly do you think you know?" I allowed a small, sad smile. "I know enough, Cody." "Meaning?" "Meaning I know about the accounts. I know about the transfers. I know about the assets that somehow never appeared on our family balance sheets." I kept my statements deliberately vague, letting him fill in the specifics with his own guilty knowledge. He took a long sip of whiskey, his eyes never leaving mine. "You've misunderstood some routine business structures. My team will clarify everything for the court." "Will they?" I asked softly. "Will they explain the quarterly transfers to Grand Cayman, the shell company in Bermuda, the property purchases through nominees in Monaco?" With each question, I watched his expression tighten incrementally. I had never specified amounts, dates, or exact mechanisms, just enough accurate details to suggest comprehensive knowledge while revealing nothing about my sources or the extent of my information. He set his glass down carefully. "What do you want, Haley?" And there it was, the pivot from denial to negotiation, the first significant shift in our power dynamic. "I want what's fair," I replied simply. He laughed, a short, harsh sound. "Fair? You've been the beneficiary of my work, my connections, my financial acumen for 15 years. The lifestyle you've grown accustomed to exists because of me. Is that what you tell yourself?" I kept my tone gentle, almost sympathetic. "That I contributed nothing? That I was merely decorative?" "I'm not saying you contributed nothing." He backtracked slightly, shifting to a more conciliatory approach. "But let's be realistic about the value equation here." I stood up, smoothing my skirt with deliberate calm. "I think we have different definitions of value, Cody. Always have." I moved toward the door, then paused and turned back. "Oh, and Esther suggested I mention that any attempts to move or liquidate contested assets during divorce proceedings could be problematic, particularly assets that weren't properly disclosed initially." The color drained from his face slightly. "Is that a threat?" "Not at all," I replied evenly. "Just sharing relevant legal information. Isn't that what these conversations are for?" Open communication? As I left, I felt his eyes boring into my back, his mind undoubtedly racing through scenarios, calculating risks, reevaluating his position. For the first time, uncertainty had entered his equation. In the elevator, I texted Esther a single word. Initiated. Within hours, her team would file additional requests targeting 3 more of Cody's secret structures, entities I had known about for years, but strategically held back from the initial filing. Each new revelation would increase his anxiety, forcing him to wonder what else I knew, how I knew it, and most importantly, what I planned to do with the information. The first, direct confrontation had achieved exactly what I intended. Destabilization. Cody now faced an adversary he hadn't anticipated, not the helpless, uninformed wife he had expected, but someone with knowledge he couldn't account for and composure he couldn't rattle. The balance of power had shifted, subtly but unmistakably, and he was only beginning to realize it. After leaving Cody in our former home, I didn't immediately return to my hidden penthouse. Instead, I instructed my driver to take me to Central Park. Despite the chill in the air, I needed to walk, to process what had just transpired and what it represented. As I followed the winding paths around the reservoir, the late afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the water, I found myself in a curious emotional state. Not exactly triumph, not exactly vindication, but something more nuanced. A crystalline clarity about who I had been, who I had become, and the distance between those two versions of myself. 3 years ago, when I first discovered Cody's betrayal, my initial reaction had been pain so acute it felt physical, a hollowing, sensation beneath my ribs, as if something vital had been extracted. I had loved him, or at least the carefully constructed version of him he had allowed me to see. I had built my life around our partnership, compromised my ambitions for what I thought was our shared future. The woman I had been then would have confronted him immediately. Tears, accusations, demands for explanations. She would have sought reconciliation, or at least emotional closure. She would have needed him to acknowledge the depth of his betrayal, to witness the pain he had caused. But that confrontation would have given him exactly what he wanted: emotional leverage, confirmation of his power to affect me, the satisfaction of seeing me diminished by his actions. Instead, I had chosen a different path. Not out of vindictiveness, though I won't pretend that element was entirely absent, but out of a deeper recognition. The rules of the game we were playing had always been different than I'd understood. While I had been investing in a partnership, Cody had been executing a long-term transaction. My value to him had always been calculated in terms of enhancement to his image, access to my connections, the prestige of an accomplished wife who, nonetheless, remained in his shadow. The revelation wasn't just about his financial deception or even his infidelity. It was about recognizing that the entire foundation of our relationship had been built on fundamentally misaligned values. I stopped at a bench overlooking the water, watching runners circle the reservoir in their relentless loops. My phone buzzed, with a message from Marcus. Target accessed Attorney Portal 3X since meeting, making urgent calls. Surveillance continuing. Cody was rattled, exactly as intended. But my satisfaction came not from his discomfort, but from my own evolution. The woman who had walked out of that penthouse today was not the same one who had discovered his betrayal 3 years ago. The differences went beyond strategy, beyond the careful preparations and counter-moves. I had reclaimed something essential that had been slowly, almost imperceptibly eroded during our marriage. My sense of self-determination, my absolute clarity about my own worth, not as it related to him or to any external validation, but as an intrinsic truth. My phone buzzed. Again. Agnes this time. Markets closing, all positions secure, contingencies in place. The technical details of my financial strategy were complex, but the underlying principle was simple: independence. Not just from Cody specifically, but from the need for any external validation of my value. The wealth I had built wasn't just about money, though $4.7 billion certainly provided extraordinary freedom. It was about creating a foundation that was entirely mine, reflecting my judgments, my risk tolerance, my vision. The sun dipped lower, casting golden light across the park. I continued walking, my pace measured, unhurried. Another message appeared. Esther confirming that the additional filings had been submitted, precisely timed for maximum legal impact. Each of these messages represented a strand in the web I had patiently constructed over 3 years. Financial, legal, informational, strategic, layers of preparation that had transformed what could have been a devastating loss into a position of unexpected strength. But there was another transformation, one less visible but more fundamental. The pain that had initially driven me, the hurt of betrayal, the shock of discovering Cody's true nature, had evolved into something clearer and colder. Not hatred, which would still represent an emotional investment in him, but a profound indifference. I no longer needed him to recognize what he had lost in me, to regret his choices, to suffer for his arrogance. His journey was his own, distinct from my path forward. This was perhaps the most unexpected gift of his betrayal: complete emotional freedom. The realization that his opinion of me, his assessment of my worth, his very existence in my world, none of it was necessary to my happiness or success. As I completed my circuit of the reservoir, the lights of the city beginning to glimmer in the gathering dusk, I felt a sense of alignment that had been absent for too long. My external actions and my internal reality were finally congruent. No more performance, no more compromise, no more strategic diminishment of my capabilities to accommodate someone else's ego. The divorce was still unfolding, the legal complexities still in motion, but in the most essential way, I had already moved beyond it. Beyond him. I texted my driver to pick me up at the East 90th Street entrance. As I waited, a final message appeared, this one from Orson. Preparing for acceleration. All systems ready. The next phase would move more quickly, with less room for Cody to maneuver, less opportunity for him to recover his balance. Where the past 3 years had been about patient preparation, the coming weeks would be about precise execution. The black SUV pulled up, my driver stepping out to open the door with professional discretion. As I settled into the leather seat, I found myself thinking not about Cody's reaction to today's revelations, but about the projects I wanted to pursue once this chapter was definitively closed. Technologies that could address climate adaptation challenges. Medical research that had been underfunded due to market failures rather than scientific obstacles. Educational innovations for communities systematically excluded from opportunity. For too long, my ambitions had been contained within the narrow parameters of what complemented rather than challenged Cody's self-image. Now, with billions at my disposal and complete independence of action, I could pursue impact at a scale I had only imagined before. The SUV moved smoothly through evening traffic, the city transforming around us as we passed from the old money quietude of the Upper East Side to the vibrant energy of downtown. I watched the changing neighborhoods through tinted windows, feeling a quiet certainty settle over me. Whatever happened next in the chess match with Cody, whatever desperate counter-moves he might attempt as he realized the true extent of his miscalculation, I had already achieved the most important victory. Had reclaimed myself. Everything else was just details. The true origins of our marriage's dissolution began long before I discovered Cody's offshore accounts, before Katrina entered the picture, even before the subtle power shifts that characterized our later years together. The seeds were planted in the fundamental dynamics we established from the beginning, dynamics I didn't fully recognize until I was already entangled in them. Cody's courtship had been brilliant in its strategic efficiency. He identified what I valued intellectual engagement, professional respect, shared ambition, and presented a version of himself perfectly calibrated to those preferences. We discussed emerging technologies over dinner, debated investment theses on weekend getaways, shared articles and research papers with thoughtful annotations. In those early days, he consistently elevated my expertise, asked incisive questions about my work, introduced me to contacts who could further my professional goals. He seemed genuinely proud of my accomplishments, eager to be associated with my success rather than threatened by it. The courtship phase was, I now understand, a sophisticated form of mirroring, reflecting back to me exactly what I wanted to see while revealing very little of his authentic self. Our engagement coincided with a crucial inflection point in both our careers. My cybersecurity company was navigating acquisition talks with several major tech firms, while Cody was positioning for a significant promotion within Meridian Ventures. The narrative of our partnership, young power couple combining technological innovation and financial acumen, generated valuable professional currency for both of us. The wedding at the plaza was less a personal milestone than a strategic alliance announcement. The guest list read like a who's who of tech investors and financial power brokers. The gifts included pre-IPO stock options and introductions to limited access investment opportunities. Our honeymoon was strategically scheduled around a major technology conference in Singapore. The first subtle shift occurred approximately 18 months into our marriage. My company's acquisition had been finalized, a 9-figure exit that significantly increased my personal net worth and professional standing. Rather than celebrating this milestone as a shared success, Cody's reaction was subtly proprietary, speaking about our exit in professional settings, gradually repositioning my achievement as a joint victory. "We should think carefully about your next move," he said one evening, emphasis on the "we" that increasingly governed our decisions. Something that complements rather than competes with my portfolio at Meridian. I didn't recognize this statement for what it was, the first, explicit boundary being drawn around my professional autonomy. Instead, I interpreted it as thoughtful partnership planning, a reasonable consideration of our mutual interests. A pattern established itself over the subsequent years. My individual identity, professional, social, even personal, was gradually subsumed into our shared identity, which increasingly centered around Cody's priorities and preferences. The process was so incremental as to be nearly imperceptible. A suggestion that I decline a board position because it might create complications with his clients. The gradual replacement of my longtime friends with his approved social circle. The subtle redirecting of conversations when my expertise threatened to overshadow his. Each individual instance seemed minor, reasonable, the normal compromises of marriage. Collectively, they represented a comprehensive strategy of containment, allowing me enough expression to remain fulfilled, but never enough to eclipse his centrality in our narrative. By our 5th anniversary, the dynamic was firmly entrenched. I had transitioned from founder and CEO to advisor and board member. My schedule revolved around his professional obligations. Even our home reflected his aesthetic preferences rather than mine. Modern minimalism that photographed well for architectural digests rather than the warmer, more eclectic spaces I had created before our marriage. The financial entanglement happened similarly. What began as reasonable consolidation of resources for tax efficiency became increasingly opaque systems, where my access was mediated through his financial team. Quarterly reviews focused on overall growth rather than specific allocations. Documentation was summarized rather than comprehensive. Again, each step seemed logical in isolation. Our lives were complex, our assets diversified, specialization made sense. His team handled the details. I focused on strategic input. A reasonable division of labor between partners with different expertise. Except it wasn't a partnership. It was a gradual, deliberate transfer of control. Looking back with clear eyes, I can identify the critical juncture where I could have changed course. Approximately 7 years into our marriage, I was offered the opportunity to lead a significant new venture, a quantum computing initiative backed by some of the most respected names in the industry. The role would have returned me to an operational position, reconnected me with the cutting edge of technology, and established an identity distinct from Cody's sphere. His response was masterfully executed, not direct opposition, which I might have resisted, but concerned support. Worries about work-life balance. Questions about the venture's financial viability. Subtle reminders of the freedom our current arrangement provided. "You've already proven yourself," he said, his tone reasonable, even loving. "Why return to those pressures when you don't need to? We're building something together that's bigger than any single company." I declined the position. It remains the decision I most regret, not for the opportunity itself, but for what it represented. The moment I explicitly chose the identity he had constructed for me over the path I might have forged independently. Subsequent years brought increasing isolation, professionally and personally. My closest confidants, those who might have helped me recognize the dynamic, were gradually edged out of our lives. My mentor Agnes, whose sharp assessment of Cody had proven uncomfortably accurate, was dismissed as old school and out of touch with modern finance. What I didn't realize then was that Cody's need for control wasn't simply about ego or power. It was about insecurity, a fundamental belief that relationships were transactional, value was hierarchical, and partnerships were zero-sum competitions. Rather than collaborative endeavors, for him to win, someone had to lose. For him to be extraordinary, those around him had to be diminished. His success required my reduction. This pattern was established long before Katrina entered the picture, before the offshore accounts, before the exit strategy that ultimately led to our divorce. Those were merely symptoms of the underlying pathology. Worldview in which people were assets to be acquired, managed, and eventually discarded when their perceived value no longer served his narrative. Understanding this context doesn't excuse his betrayal, but it explains why the path to my recovery couldn't be simply financial or legal. It required a fundamental recalibration of my sense of self, a return to the woman I had been before I allowed my identity to be incrementally erased. The strategy I developed over 3 years wasn't simply about building parallel wealth or protecting assets from Cody's eventual betrayal. It was a comprehensive system designed to fundamentally alter the equation between us, financially, legally, informationally, and psychologically. The financial architecture formed the foundation, beginning with that initial $2 million from my angel investment. I created an expanding network of entities structured in concentric layers of privacy. Each layer served a specific purpose. The outermost layer consisted of legitimate investment vehicles, venture funds, private equity positions, real estate holdings, that operated completely separately from Cody's financial ecosystem. These entities generated verifiable returns and established my independent financial identity. The middle layer utilized more sophisticated structures. Singapore variable capital companies, Luxembourg special limited partnerships, Cayman segregated portfolio companies. These entities provided both legitimate tax efficiency and strategic opacity. The innermost layer employed what Orson called quantum financial structures, entities that existed in multiple jurisdictional states simultaneously. Their ownership deliberately ambiguous, their assets structured to be reconfigurable based on triggering events. Through this architecture, I built not just parallel wealth, but wealth that was fundamentally inaccessible to conventional discovery. By the time Cody filed for divorce, my $4.7 billion existed in a state of what legal theorists call strategic indeterminacy, simultaneously mine and not mine, depending on which legal framework was applied. The informational component was equally sophisticated. Marcus established comprehensive surveillance of Cody's communications, financial movements, and personal activities, not for emotional satisfaction, but for strategic awareness. Every significant decision I made was informed by perfect knowledge of his plans, sometimes before he had fully formulated them himself. More importantly, we created what Marcus called information asymmetry moats, ensuring that Cody's knowledge of my activities, resources, and intentions remained minimal, while my knowledge of his was maximal. The legal framework, developed with Esther, wasn't designed merely for the divorce itself, but for the complex aftermath. We created multiple contingency pathways, each activated by different potential actions from Cody. If he pursued aggressive litigation, one set of structures would engage. If he attempted settlement, another. If he tried to hide assets, a third. Each pathway was designed to maximize my position while systematically diminishing his leverage. The key innovation was that these structures operated algorithmically. Once initiated, they proceeded according to predetermined parameters without requiring my ongoing intervention. But perhaps the most crucial element was psychological. I studied Cody's decision patterns, emotional triggers, and cognitive biases. I mapped his relationships, cataloged his insecurities, documented his habits. This allowed me to predict with remarkable accuracy how he would respond to various stimuli. The masterpiece of the strategy was its integrated nature. Financial maneuvers triggered informational advantages, which created legal leverage, which exploited psychological vulnerabilities. Each component reinforced the others in a self-strengthening system. What made this strategy ultimately unbeatable wasn't its complexity, but its asymmetry. Cody was playing a conventional game with defined rules and recognizable objectives. I was playing an entirely different game, one whose parameters he couldn't see and whose victory conditions he couldn't recognize until it was too late. In essence, I had created not just a plan, but a system that would execute itself regardless of his countermoves. The moment he filed for divorce, believing he had secured his advantage, the mechanism was already in motion, proceeding with the inevitable logic of its design toward a conclusion that had been determined years before. 2 days after my confrontation with Cody at our former home, I initiated the escalation phase, transitioning from defensive positioning to strategic offensive measures. This phase wasn't about revenge, but about systematic realignment of power, executed with surgical precision. The first escalation move targeted Cody's professional reputation. For 15 years, he had meticulously cultivated his image as a financial visionary with impeccable judgment. This carefully constructed persona was both his greatest asset and his most vulnerable point. Through Esther, I arranged for specific documentation to be anonymously delivered to 3 key figures: the managing partner at Meridian Ventures, the compliance officer at their primary investment bank, and a senior editor at the Wall Street Journal who specialized in financial investigations. The materials didn't contain direct allegations. Those could be denied or discredited. Instead, they provided data points that raised specific questions about pattern anomalies in certain investment vehicles. Cody had structured. Not enough to prove misconduct, but sufficient to trigger the one thing he couldn't afford: scrutiny. Within 24 hours, Marcus confirmed that Cody had been called to an emergency meeting with Meridian's executive committee. That same day, the compliance team at his bank initiated a review of his personal accounts. The journalist, meanwhile, began making preliminary inquiries among sources in the financial community. The second escalation moved from professional to social domains. Kyle arranged for information about Cody's divorce filing, specifically the vindictive terms he had proposed, to reach key figures in our social circle. Not through obvious leaks, but through seemingly accidental revelations at strategic moments. Document glimpsed on a shared screen during a charity board video call. A conversation overheard at the right cocktail party. A concerned mutual friend checking on my well-being in just the right company. Within a week, subtle but significant shifts occurred in Cody's social capital. Invitations to key events mysteriously failed to arrive. Certain calls went unreturned. The effortless social access he had always enjoyed became suddenly, inexplicably constrained. The third and most consequential escalation involved Katrina. Not through direct confrontation, that would have been both predictable and ineffective, but through information asymmetry. Using materials from Marcus's surveillance, I arranged for Katrina to obtain specific knowledge about Cody's financial vulnerabilities and legal exposure. Not presented as an attack, but as information she deserved to know from a seemingly concerned colleague worried about her future. Simultaneously, I ensured Cody discovered communications suggesting Katrina was exploring career opportunities that would take her abroad. Opportunities I had quietly arranged to be presented to her. Through third parties, the seeds of mutual suspicion were planted with remarkable efficiency. Their relationship, built on opportunism rather than genuine connection, began showing strain precisely when Cody most needed stability in his personal life. These escalations operated in concert, creating compounding pressure points. As his professional standing came under question, his social support system weakened. As his relationship with Katrina developed cracks, his emotional resilience diminished. As each domain of his life required urgent attention, his ability to focus on fighting the divorce deteriorated. Most importantly, none of these measures could be directly traced to me. Each appeared to be a natural consequence of his own choices, the inevitable result of his behavior rather than orchestrated countermoves. This was the fundamental principle of the escalation phase: systematic pressure applied precisely where it would be most effective, timed for maximum impact, disguised as organic developments rather than deliberate actions. The essence of true power isn't in demonstrative force, but in catalyzing consequences that appear inevitable, a principle Cody was now learning through direct experience. The final confrontation with Cody occurred 32 days after he filed for divorce. By then, the compounding pressures of my escalation strategy had created exactly the conditions I had anticipated: professional uncertainty, social isolation, personal instability, and above all, the dawning realization that he had severely miscalculated. My phone rang at 11:23 p.m., Cody's name on the screen. "We need to talk," he said when I answered, his voice tightly controlled but with an underlying strain I hadn't heard before. Not through lawyers, just us. I remained silent for a calculated moment. When? Now. Tonight. The urgency was evident. "I'll come to you, wherever you are." This was significant. His willingness to come to me, to enter territory he didn't control. The power dynamic had already shifted more than he realized. "The Four Seasons. Suite 4701, I replied, naming not my actual residence, but a hotel suite. I had maintained for precisely this possibility. A neutral setting, secured and prepared according to my specifications. "I'll be there in 30 minutes. I arrived before him, of course. The suite had been specially prepared, elegant but impersonal, with subtle security measures in place. Marcus had installed discreet recording systems, and Kyle had positioned additional security in adjacent rooms. Nothing was left to chance. Cody arrived 40 minutes later, looking noticeably different from our previous meeting. The immaculate presentation remained, expensive suit, perfect grooming, but something had changed in his bearing. The unshakable confidence had acquired a brittle quality, like ice beginning to crack under pressure. He declined my offer of a drink, remaining standing as if to assert some control over the interaction. "This has gone far enough, Haley." I sat, comfortably in an armchair, deliberately relaxed. "What has?" "You know exactly what." His jaw tightened. "The questions at Meridian, the compliance review, the rumors, none of it is coincidental." I tilted my head slightly, my expression neutral. Are you accusing me of something specific, Cody? He paced, tension radiating from him. I want to know what your endgame is. What? Do you actually want? I believe I've been clear from the beginning. A fair settlement. He laughed, a harsh sound without humor. Fair. You keep using that word. What's your definition of fair? A recognition of my contribution to what we built. Together, an honest accounting of all assets, a division that reflects reality rather than your preferred narrative. He stopped pacing, studying me with narrowed eyes. You've changed. Yes, I agreed simply. The admission seemed to unsettle him more than denial would have. He had expected either defensive justification or emotional appeal, familiar dynamics he knew how to manipulate. My calm acknowledgement offered no purchase. Here's what's going to happen, he said, attempting to reclaim control of the conversation. We're going to settle this quietly. My final offer is 20% of disclosed assets. That's more than generous considering the circumstances. I smiled slightly. And what about the undisclosed assets, Cody? The accounts in Grand Cayman, Bermuda, Singapore? The shell companies in Luxembourg and Liechtenstein? The bearer's shares held in that safety deposit box in Geneva? The color drained from his face so rapidly it was almost concerning. These weren't the vague references I had made during our previous confrontation. These were specific, accurate details about his most secretive financial structures, information he believed only he and his most trusted advisors possessed. How could you possibly, he began, then stopped abruptly, reassessing. What do you want? Everything that's rightfully mine. Which is? Half of everything we built together. All of what was always mine. He scoffed, but the sound lacked conviction. You won't get it. No court would. This isn't about courts, Cody. My voice remained perfectly even. This is about mathematics, the incontrovertible reality of your situation. I rose and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Your position at Meridian is already compromised. The compliance review has identified irregularities that will be impossible to explain satisfactorily. 3 of your largest clients have quietly begun moving their accounts. Katrina has accepted a position in Singapore, effective next month. I turned back to face him. Your carefully constructed world is not collapsing because of any action I've taken. It's collapsing under the weight of your own choices. He stared at me, something like fear finally breaching his carefully maintained facade. What have you done? Nothing, I replied truthfully. I've simply stopped pretending not to see what was always there. In that moment, the final shift occurred, the complete inversion of the power dynamic that had defined our relationship for 15 years. For the first time, Cody faced not just a temporary setback, but existential uncertainty. Not just the loss of specific assets, but the potential unraveling of his entire carefully constructed identity. The settlement papers will be delivered tomorrow, I said quietly. They represent a clean division, fair by any objective standard. Sign them, and this ends quietly. Choose otherwise, and the consequences will proceed according to their own logic. The implication was clear. The pressures he had experienced thus far were merely preliminary. The real consequences remained in reserve, held back not out of mercy but strategic patience. Cody looked at me as if seeing a stranger. In many ways, he was. The woman he had married, or thought he had married, no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had not only matched his capacity for strategic thinking, but had fundamentally surpassed it. Without another word, he turned and left the suite. We both knew the confrontation was over. The only question that remained was whether he would accept the inevitable with what dignity remained to him, or force the final, irreversible escalation I had prepared but hoped not to deploy. In the 72 hours following our final confrontation, Cody's carefully constructed world began its systematic deconstruction. Not through any additional action on my part. The mechanisms were already in motion, proceeding with the relentless logic of cause and effect. The first domino fell 16 hours after our meeting. Marcus's monitoring systems captured a frantic video call between Cody and his private banker in Geneva. The conversation revealed that access to certain key accounts had been mysteriously restricted pending routine compliance verification, a process triggered by algorithms Orson had designed months earlier. This wasn't illegal interference, simply strategic application of the same financial compliance systems banks use to flag suspicious activity. In Cody's case, specific transaction patterns had been subtly highlighted for review, creating bureaucratic obstacles that would take weeks to resolve. By the following morning, the professional consequences accelerated. The managing partner at IAO, Meridian Ventures, requested an immediate meeting with their legal team present. Though I wasn't privy to the conversation itself, the outcome became clear when Cody's executive biography disappeared from the firm's website 3 hours later. Press release followed. Meridian Ventures announces organizational changes effective immediately. The careful corporate language masked the reality of what had occurred. Cody had been placed on administrative leave, pending review of certain investment structures, a professional purgatory from which few ever returned. The social consequences unfolded in parallel. Invitations were rescinded. Standing reservations at exclusive restaurants became mysteriously unavailable. The subtle machinery of high society exclusion operated with ruthless efficiency once the signal had been given that Cody's status had changed. Most telling was the sudden absence of calls and messages from people who had once sought his favor. Marcus's monitoring showed the precipitous decline in communication, a digital representation of social abandonment happening in real time. The personal consequences were perhaps the most predictable but no less devastating. 48 hours after our meeting, Katrina's assistant collected her personal items from Cody's penthouse while he was in meetings with his legal team. By evening, she had boarded a flight to Singapore, 2 weeks earlier than the position ostensibly required. She left without a personal goodbye, sending only a brief text. "This isn't what I signed up for. Good luck with everything." The message's timestamp showed it was sent when her flight was already airborne, a digital farewell designed to prevent response or persuasion. Within 3 days, Cody had lost his professional standing, social position, and personal relationship, the 3 pillars that had supported his identity and self-conception. What made these consequences so devastating wasn't just their substance, but their apparent inevitability. None could be directly attributed to vindictive action on my part. Each appeared to be the natural result of his own choices, his own behaviors, his own vulnerabilities exposed to natural scrutiny. The settlement papers arrived at his attorney's office as promised. The terms were, by objective standards, reasonable, a clean 50-50 division of our documented marital assets. No punitive claims, no excessive demands. What the documents didn't mention, of course, was the parallel fortune I had built, the billions, that existed beyond the boundaries of our marital estate, secured through structures he couldn't access or even fully comprehend. The most remarkable aspect of the aftermath was Cody's isolation. In constructing his life around transactions rather than relationships, he had created no genuine support system. Those who had surrounded him, colleagues, social connections, even Katrina, had been attracted to his success, his status, his utility to their own ambitions. When those external markers of value diminished, so did their interest in him as a person. The transactional worldview that had guided his approach to our marriage ultimately defined all his relationships, and when he could no longer offer favorable terms, those relationships revealed their conditional nature. 5 days after our confrontation, Cody's attorney contacted Esther requesting an in-person meeting to discuss potential adjustments to the proposed settlement. The language was professional, but the subtext was clear: capitulation. Cody had finally recognized what I had known for 3 years, that true power lies not in controlling others, but in creating systems that operate independently of direct control, generating consequences that appear both natural and inevitable. The finalization of the divorce occurred with remarkable efficiency once Cody accepted the inevitable. What might have been years of contentious litigation concluded in less than 6 weeks. The settlement agreement was signed without fanfare. A simple DocuSign notification appearing on my phone one Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing investment proposals in my Tribeca penthouse. That digital signature marked the formal end of our 15-year marriage. But my personal transformation had been completed long before the legal dissolution. The woman who signed those documents bore little resemblance to the one who had discovered Cody's betrayal 3 years earlier. The most profound change wasn't financial, though $4.7 billion certainly provided extraordinary freedom. It wasn't social, though I had reconstructed my circle with people chosen for authenticity rather than utility. It wasn't even professional, though I had reclaimed my identity as a strategic thinker and technological innovator. The fundamental transformation was internal, a complete recalibration of how I understood value, power, and my own identity. For too long, I had accepted Cody's framing of our world: success measured by acquisition, value determined by external validation, power expressed through control over others. In gradually extracting myself from that framework, I had discovered an entirely different paradigm. True wealth wasn't about accumulation but about agency, the capacity to pursue what mattered without constraint. The billions I had built were significant not for their numerical value, but for the latitude they provided to invest in transformative technologies, support overlooked causes, explore ideas without concern for immediate return. True connection wasn't transactional but relational, built on mutual recognition rather than mutual utility. During my years of preparation, I had reconstructed my inner circle with extraordinary care. Agnes remained my closest advisor, her sharp mind undimmed by age. Esther, Marcus, Orson, and Kyle had begun as hired specialists, but evolved into trusted partners, each bringing unique perspective to challenges we now tackled together. Most significantly, I had reconnected with individuals from my pre-Cody life. Former colleagues, mentors, friends whose relationships had been based on genuine affinity rather than strategic advantage. These reconnections helped me rediscover aspects of myself that had been submerged during my marriage: my irreverent humor, my passion for obscure technological problems, my appreciation for unconventional thinking. True power, I had learned, wasn't about dominance but about discernment, the ability to perceive reality accurately and respond appropriately. The strength of my position against Cody hadn't come from resources or tactics alone, but from seeing clearly the patterns he couldn't recognize, understanding dynamics he couldn't perceive. This clarity now extended to all areas of my life. I evaluated opportunities not by status or appearance, but by substance and impact. I judged character not by polish or pedigree, but by consistency and integrity. I measured success not by comparison to others, but by alignment with my own values. The morning after the divorce was finalized, I woke early and walked to the rooftop terrace of my penthouse. The city was just beginning to stir, the first light illuminating the skyline with a clarity that seemed significant. I had always been an early riser, but during my marriage, I had adapted to Cody's preference for late mornings. This simple reclamation of my natural rhythm symbolized the broader recalibration. I had already initiated several new ventures: a quantum computing initiative focused on climate modeling, a medical research foundation targeting neglected diseases, an educational technology platform designed to democratize advanced learning. Each reflected priorities that had been important to me before my identity became subsumed in Cody's narrative. These weren't chosen as repudiations of my past, but as affirmations of my authentic interests. the first expressions of a voice that had been temporarily muted, but never truly silenced. The legal end of my marriage didn't feel like conclusion, but like commencement, the formal beginning of a life I had already been constructing. The document simply acknowledged what had already occurred: my complete emancipation from a relationship that had evolved from partnership to containment. Standing on that rooftop, watching the city awaken, I experienced what can only be described as radical freedom, not just from Cody specifically, but from external definitions of success, from prescribed paths, from the subtle constraints I had internalized over years of gradual compromise. The woman who had once calculated her words to avoid threatening a fragile male ego now spoke with unfiltered clarity. The professional who had stepped back from operational roles to support her husband's career now launched ambitious ventures based on her own vision. The social figure who had hosted events designed to enhance her husband's status now created gatherings centered on ideas rather than influence. The transformation was complete. Not because I had won against Cody, though that victory was undeniable, but because I had recognized and dismantled the internal structures that had made his influence possible in the first place. I had not just secured my freedom from a specific relationship. I had liberated myself from an entire framework of valuation that had never truly served me. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, I received an unexpected message from an encrypted email address I didn't recognize. The subject line read, simply, "Regarding CB, important." The body contained nothing but a date, time, and the name of an obscure cafe in the West Village. My first instinct was to disregard it. The divorce was settled, my new life well underway. But something about the clinical precision of the message suggested it wasn't random. After having Marcus verify the message contained no malicious code or tracking elements, I decided to attend, taking appropriate security precautions. I arrived, 15 minutes early, positioning myself at a corner table with clear sightlines to both the entrance and rear exit. Kyle's team had secured the surrounding area, with 2 operatives discreetly seated at nearby tables. At precisely the appointed time, a woman entered the cafe, mid-50s, impeccably dressed in understated luxury, carrying herself with the confident ease of someone accustomed to power. I didn't recognize her, but her assessment of the room was too systematic to be casual. Her gaze settled on me with quiet recognition, though we had never met. She approached without hesitation. "Ms. Parker, I'm Eleanor Blackwell." The surname registered immediately, Blackwell, Cody's mother. I gestured to the seat across from me, maintaining a neutral expression despite my surprise. Eleanor Blackwell was a near-mythic figure in Cody's narrative, the brilliant economist who had raised him alone after his father abandoned them, who had sacrificed everything for his education, who had instilled in him the drive that defined his career. In 15 years of marriage, I had never met her. Cody had always claimed she was reclusive, preferring her research position at a university in Switzerland to social engagement. Our communication had been limited to perfunctory birthday cards and occasional brief phone calls on holidays. "Thank you for coming," she said, declining the offer of coffee from the approaching server. "I'll be direct. I've been monitoring the situation between you and my son for some time." The implication was clear and startling. She had been aware of our conflict, perhaps even its underlying causes, long before it became public. "I should clarify," she continued, noting my expression, "that Cody and I have not been close for many years, despite the narrative he's constructed. My interest in your situation is professional as well as personal." She reached into her bag and placed a small leather portfolio on the table. "I believe these might provide context for some questions you may still have." Inside were documents that immediately shifted my understanding of everything that had transpired: financial records, correspondence, and most significantly, strategic plans dating back to before I had even met Cody. He was recruited directly out of business school, Eleanor explained, her tone clinically detached despite discussing her son. Meridian identified him as having the precise psychological profile they sought: ambitious but insecure, intelligent but not original, driven but ultimately controllable. The documents revealed an astonishing truth. Cody had never been the strategic mastermind behind his success. He had been an exceptionally effective frontman for interests that operated at a level of financial sophistication far beyond his comprehension. His career, his investments, even aspects of his personal life had been guided by handlers he never recognized as such. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, processing the implications. "Because you did something unexpected," she replied. "You not only outmaneuvered Cody, which isn't particularly difficult for someone of your capabilities, but you constructed a parallel financial architecture that even Meridian's surveillance couldn't penetrate. That caught certain people's attention." The conversation that followed revealed dimensions to my own story I hadn't realized existed. Eleanor wasn't just Cody's estranged mother. She was a senior strategist for a network of family offices controlling generational wealth, measured in hundreds of billions. This network had been observing my financial innovations with professional interest. "We've been watching how you deployed capital through those quantum structures Orson designed for you," she said, referencing my financial architect by name with unsettling familiarity, "particularly your positions in synthetic biology and quantum encryption. They suggest a strategic vision that aligns with certain long-horizon initiatives." By the conversation's end, the revelation was clear. My victory over Cody hadn't just been personal, it had been an unexpected audition of sorts. My 3-year counter-strategy had demonstrated capabilities that had brought me to the attention of networks operating in financial dimensions I hadn't known existed. Eleanor left me with a simple encrypted drive and a proposition to consider. Not employment, not partnership, but something more ambiguous: access to information architectures and capital deployment mechanisms that operated beyond conventional financial systems. As she departed, she paused. "You thought you were just freeing yourself from Cody. In reality, you were demonstrating capacities that transcend that limited context entirely." I sat alone in the cafe long after she'd gone, absorbing the realization that the game I thought I'd been playing had been nested within a larger game I hadn't even perceived. The revelation from Eleanor Blackwell lingered in my mind as I stood on the balcony of my Tribeca penthouse, watching the sunset cast long shadows across the city. The encrypted drive she had given me remained on my desk, unopened, a threshold I wasn't yet certain I wanted to cross. My journey had begun with a singular purpose: to protect myself from Cody's betrayal, to ensure I wouldn't be left vulnerable when his inevitable exit came. That mission had been accomplished with a thoroughness even I hadn't fully anticipated. The divorce was finalized, my fortune secure, my future entirely my own. Yet Eleanor's appearance had revealed an unsettling truth: the game never ends. It simply evolves into more complex iterations with higher stakes and more sophisticated players. The very capabilities that had secured my freedom from Cody had also made me visible to forces operating on levels I was only beginning to comprehend. This recognition prompted a fundamental question: what does true victory actually mean? When I discovered Cody's betrayal 3 years ago, I defined victory in oppositional terms: ensuring he wouldn't win, wouldn't take what was mine, wouldn't leave. Me vulnerable. My strategy had been brilliant in its execution, comprehensive in its success. By any conventional measure, I had won completely. But standing here now, I recognized the limitation of victory defined by opposition. Outmaneuvering Cody, while satisfying and necessary, was ultimately a response to his actions rather than an expression of my own autonomous purpose. It had freed me from a specific constraint, but hadn't fully defined what that freedom was for. The more profound victory wasn't over Cody, but over the mindset he represented. The transactional view of relationships, the equation of worth with possession, The belief that power meant control over others rather than authorship of one's own experience. Eleanor's unexpected appearance had inadvertently clarified something essential. I could continue playing ever more sophisticated versions of the same game, moving to higher levels with bigger stakes and more powerful players. Or I could choose a different game entirely, one defined by my own values rather than reactive positioning against others. The $4.7 billion I had accumulated provided extraordinary optionality, but true freedom didn't come from the amount itself, but from the clarity with which it was deployed. Finance had been the arena of my counter-strategy against Cody, because that was where the threat had manifested. But it needn't define the purpose, toward which my reclaimed agency was directed. I turned away from the view and walked to my desk, my gaze falling on the encrypted drive. The networks Eleanor represented offered access to financial dimensions beyond what I had already mastered, knowledge architectures and capital deployment mechanisms operating at global scale. After a moment's consideration, I placed the drive in a secure drawer rather than immediately accessing its contents, not as rejection, but as assertion of the principle that would guide my decisions moving forward. Deliberate choice rather than reactive response. Whatever path I chose, whether engaging with Eleanor's networks or pursuing entirely independent directions, would be determined by alignment with my own defined purpose rather than external validation or competitive positioning. The true lesson of my journey wasn't about wealth or revenge or even strategic brilliance. It was about the recognition that power in its most authentic form isn't measured by what you can take from others or do to others, but by your capacity to live from the center of your own values without distortion by either fear or obligation. Cody had approached life as a zero-sum game where his victory required someone else's loss. The networks Eleanor represented operated at higher levels of sophistication, but potentially within the same fundamental paradigm. The question facing me now was whether to advance within that paradigm or to step outside it entirely, to play a different game with different metrics of success. I would make that decision not from reaction, but from intention, not from opposition, but from purpose, not from the past, but toward the future I chose to create. The city lights began to emerge. As dusk deepened into evening, I felt a profound sense of completion regarding the chapter that had closed with the divorce, combined with genuine curiosity about the chapters yet to be written. The ultimate victory wasn't that I had defeated Cody or reclaimed billions, or even discovered hidden networks of influence. It was that I now stood wholly in my own authority, free not just from a specific person, but from external definitions of value, from prescribed paths, from the subtle constraints of others' expectations. The woman who had once been defined in relation to Cody Blackwell now existed entirely on her own terms, and that, in the end, was the only victory that truly mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.